The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floor of our family's estate. Everyone turned to stare as the golden liquid spread across the pristine white stone, but I barely noticed. My ears were ringing from what I'd just heard. The lawyer's words echoed in my mind like a broken record. To my son, David Mitchell, I leave Mitchell Industries in its entirety, including all assets, properties, and controlling interests. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My brother David stood there with that smug smile I'd grown to despise over the years, already shaking hands with the board members who had gathered for the reading of our father's will. 28 years old, an MBA from Harvard that Daddy paid for, and now the sole heir to an $80 million empire he'd never worked a single day to build. I watched my brother accept congratulations from men in expensive suits, men who had known me since I was 12 years old, men who had watched me work summers in the warehouse while David played golf at the country club. Not one of them looked in my direction. Not one of them seemed to remember that I existed. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 30 minutes ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was in this family. I was the daughter who chose business school over sorority life. I was the one who spent every summer learning the company from the ground up, starting in shipping and receiving, then moving through accounting, operations, and finally landing in strategic development. I was the one who stayed late every night for the past 6 years, building relationships with our suppliers, understanding every aspect of our manufacturing process, and identifying opportunities that had increased our profit margins by 30%. But apparently none of that mattered, because I wasn't born with the right anatomy. The law office felt suffocating now. The mahogany walls that had seemed so dignified when we arrived now felt like they were closing in on me. I could smell my stepmother Linda's overpowering perfume as she dabbed at fake tears with a lace handkerchief, probably already calculating how much of David's inheritance she could influence him to spend on her. She'd married my father 3 years after my mother died, when I was 15 and David was 18. She'd never made any secret of the fact that she preferred my brother. "Sarah, sweetheart," Linda approached me with her practiced, sympathetic expression, the same one she'd worn at my father's funeral 2 weeks earlier. "I know this must be difficult, but your father did leave you something." She gestured toward the lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, who was holding a much smaller envelope. My inheritance, apparently. I walked over on unsteady legs, my heels clicking against the marble with each step. The sound seemed to echo through the vast space, announcing my humiliation to everyone present. "Miss Mitchell," Mr. Pemberton said softly, extending the envelope toward me. "Your father wanted you to have this." I opened it with trembling fingers, aware that every eye in the room was on me. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a brief note written in my father's familiar handwriting. "For my daughter Sarah, to help you build your own future. Follow your dreams, sweetheart." $50,000, the same amount my father probably spent on David's car for his 16th birthday. The same amount that represented about 6 hours of the company's revenue. Follow your dreams. As if my dream hadn't been to continue the legacy he'd built, to prove that his daughter could be just as capable as any son. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my purse, my face burning with shame and anger. Around me, I could hear the whispered conversations starting up again. David was already talking about his vision for the company, using phrases like aggressive expansion and maximizing shareholder value, terms he'd learned in business school but had never applied to real-world situations. "Sarah, I hope you understand." David approached me as the crowd began to thin out. His voice carried that patronizing tone he'd perfected over the years, the same one he'd used when explaining why I couldn't play football with the neighborhood boys when we were kids. Dad knew what he was doing. Running a company like Mitchell Industries, it requires a certain kind of leadership. It's not personal. I looked up at my brother, This man who shared my DNA but felt like a complete stranger. He was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. His dark hair perfectly styled. His teeth artificially whitened to magazine model standards. He looked like success. I had to give him that. But I knew something. He didn't. I knew that looking the part and being the part were two very different things. "Of course," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I'm sure you'll do wonderfully." He seemed surprised by my calm response. I think he'd been expecting tears, maybe some dramatic outburst that would confirm his belief that women were too emotional for business. Instead, I smiled politely and excused myself to use the restroom. In the quiet of the ladies' room, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. I gripped the edge of the marble sink and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I saw my father's eyes looking back at me, the same deep brown that could be warm with laughter or sharp with determination. I saw my mother's stubborn chin, the feature that had gotten me into trouble as a child when I refused to back down from arguments with kids twice my size. But what I didn't see was defeat. What I saw was fire. I splashed cold water on my face and reapplied my lipstick, taking my time to compose myself. When I walked back out into the main office, most of the crowd had dispersed. David was huddled with Linda and two of the board members, already making plans for his transition into the CEO role. They didn't notice me gathering my things. The drive home to my apartment felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. I lived in a converted loft downtown, a space I'd chosen specifically because it was within walking distance of the Mitchell Industries headquarters. I'd imagined myself walking to work every morning, continuing the family tradition, maybe even bringing my own children to the office someday, the way my father had brought David and me when we were young. Now that dream felt foolish and naive. I parked in my assigned spot and sat in the car for several minutes, listening to the engine tick as it cooled down. Through my windshield, I could see the Mitchell Industries building rising into the evening sky. 23 floors of glass and steel that represented 3 generations of family legacy. My grandfather had started the company in 1952 with a small machine shop and a loan from the local bank. My father had transformed it into a major player in the aerospace manufacturing industry, and now it belonged to David, who had spent more time on the golf course than in the factory. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jessica, my best friend since college and one of the few people who knew how much the company meant to me. "How did it go? Call me when you're ready to talk." I wasn't ready to talk. I wasn't ready to explain to anyone how completely I'd been dismissed, how thoroughly my father had failed to see my worth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, I turned off my phone and made my way up to my apartment. The space felt different now, somehow smaller and less significant. Everything in it represented the life I'd built while working toward a future that had just been snatched away from me. The business books on my shelves, the framed photos of company milestones, the awards I'd received for various projects over the years. It all felt like evidence of a delusion I'd been living under. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my couch staring out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, David was probably celebrating with his friends, buying rounds of expensive scotch and talking about his plans for the company. Linda was probably already redecorating my father's office in her mind, choosing new furniture that would reflect her taste rather than his. And here I was, the daughter who had given everything to the family business, sitting alone with a $50,000 consolation prize and a note telling me to follow my dreams. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, something began to shift inside me. The initial shock and hurt were slowly being replaced by something else, something sharper and more focused. Because while everyone else was celebrating David's inheritance, they were all forgetting one crucial fact. They were forgetting that I knew this company better than anyone else alive. I knew which suppliers were reliable and which ones cut corners. I knew which employees were loyal and which ones were just waiting for a better offer. I knew where every inefficiency existed, where every opportunity lay untapped, and where every weakness could be exploited. David might have inherited the company, but I had inherited something far more valuable. I had inherited the knowledge of how to destroy it from the inside out. And as I finished my wine and began to formulate the beginnings of a plan, I realized that my father might have done me the biggest favor of my life. He'd set me free from any obligation to protect his legacy. He'd released me from any duty to preserve what he'd built. He'd given me permission to stop caring about the Mitchell family name. The irony was beautiful, really. In trying to exclude me from the family business, he'd created his own worst nightmare. He'd created a Mitchell with nothing left to lose. I opened my laptop and began to research corporate law, hostile takeovers, industry competitors, private equity firms. If David thought he could just slide into the CEO chair and coast on our father's reputation, he was about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating his sister. The next morning, I woke up before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I showered, dressed in my sharpest business suit, and drove to the office just like I had every day for the past 6 years. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't going to work for the family company. I was going to work against it. The security guard at the front desk smiled and waved me through, just like always. Why wouldn't he? As far as anyone knew, I was still Sarah Mitchell, daughter of the founder, loyal employee, and devoted family member. They had no idea that overnight, I'd become something much more dangerous. I'd become Sarah Mitchell, woman with a plan. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt different than usual. Instead of reviewing my daily agenda, I was mentally cataloging every piece of sensitive information I had access to, every relationship I'd built with suppliers and clients, every weakness in our systems that I'd identified over the years. Information that had once been meant to help improve the company could just as easily be used to destroy it. My assistant Rebecca was already at her desk when I arrived, holding a steaming cup of coffee and a sympathetic smile. Word had apparently traveled fast about the will reading. "Sarah, I'm so sorry about yesterday," she said softly. "It's just not fair." I accepted the coffee and smiled back, though my mind was racing. Rebecca had been with the company for 12 years. She'd started as a receptionist and worked her way up to become one of our most trusted administrative staff. She knew everyone, heard everything, and had access to more confidential information than most of the executives realized. "Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate that." I paused, testing the waters. "I imagine things are going to change around here pretty quickly." She nodded, lowering her voice. "Mr. David called a staff meeting for this afternoon. Word is he's bringing in some consultants to evaluate our operations. People are nervous." Consultants. Of course. David's first instinct would be to bring in outsiders to tell him how to run the business his father had spent 40 years building. He'd probably hired some expensive firm from New York, the kind that specialized in optimizing companies by cutting costs and maximizing short-term profits. "I'm sure it will all work out," I said carefully. "Change can be good for an organization." But as I settled into my office and began my day, I was already thinking 3 moves ahead. David's reliance on outside consultants would be his first weakness. Those consultants would be looking at spreadsheets and reports, but they wouldn't understand the relationships and nuances that made Mitchell Industries successful. They'd see opportunities for cost-cutting without understanding the long-term consequences. And I would be there to help them make every wrong decision possible. The staff meeting that afternoon was exactly what I'd expected. David stood at the front of the main conference room, looking uncomfortable in our father's position, but trying to project confidence. Behind him stood 3 people in identical dark suits, the consultants from McKinsey & Associates, one of the most expensive and ruthless consulting firms in the country. I know this transition has been difficult for everyone, David began, his voice carrying just a hint of the nervousness he was trying to hide. But I want you all to know that I'm committed to taking Mitchell Industries to the next level. To help us achieve that goal, I've brought in some experts to help us identify areas where we can improve our efficiency and profitability. I sat in the back row, taking notes and observing the faces around me. I could see the worry in people's eyes, the way they glanced at each other when David mentioned improving efficiency. Everyone knew that was corporate speak for layoffs. One of the consultants, a woman with severe black hair and cold blue eyes, stepped forward. Over the next 6 weeks, we'll be conducting a comprehensive review of all departments and operations. We'll be scheduling individual interviews with key personnel and examining all processes to identify redundancies and optimization opportunities. Redundancies. Optimization opportunities. More corporate speak for destroying people's livelihoods in the name of quarterly profits. After the meeting, I lingered in the conference room, organizing my notes while listening to the conversations around me. Employees were clustering together, whispering about updating their resumes and wondering if their jobs were safe. The atmosphere that had once been collaborative and family-oriented was already shifting towards something fearful and competitive. Sarah? David's voice interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to find him standing beside me, the consultants having moved on to examine our production schedules. I was hoping we could talk privately. I followed him to what had been our father's office and was now his. He'd already made changes. The family photos were gone, replaced by his MBA diploma and some generic motivational posters. The comfortable leather chairs where our father used to hold informal meetings had been replaced with sleek modern furniture that looked expensive but uncomfortable. I want you to know that your position here is secure, David said, settling, behind the massive oak desk that now looked too big for him. Your family, and you have valuable institutional knowledge. I'd like you to work closely with the Mackenzie team, help them understand our operations. I nodded slowly, keeping my expression neutral. Of course, I want what's best for the company. Good, I knew I could count on you. He leaned back, in the chair, trying to look relaxed, but failing. I know yesterday was difficult, but Dad made his decision for a reason. He knew this company needed strong leadership to compete in today's market. Strong leadership, as if inheriting something, made you qualified to run it. As if being born male automatically made you better suited for business than someone who had actually worked to understand every aspect of the operation. I understand, I said simply. When would you like me to start working with the consultants? Tomorrow morning. They'll want to review all of our supplier contracts and client relationships first. Your expertise in those areas will be invaluable. Perfect. He was asking me to hand over the very information that could be used to dismantle everything our father had built. He was literally inviting me to sabotage his efforts, though he was too naive to realize it. That evening, I went home and began to put my plan into motion. I started with research, using my industry connections to learn everything I could about Mackenzie and Associates and their typical recommendations. I studied their previous clients, examining which companies had thrived under their guidance and which had been systematically destroyed. Then I began to prepare my own recommendations, suggestions that would sound reasonable on the surface, but would slowly poison the company from within. I would recommend cutting costs in areas that seemed redundant but were actually crucial for long-term stability. I would suggest contract renegotiations that would save money in the short term but damage our relationships with key suppliers. I would identify inefficiencies that were actually the very practices that made our clients loyal to us. And I would do it all with a smile, presenting myself as the helpful insider who just wanted to see the company succeed under David's leadership. The beauty of my plan was its subtlety. I wouldn't do anything dramatic or obvious that could be traced back to me. Instead, I would simply guide David and his consultants toward making the kinds of decisions that would slowly erode the company's foundation. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it would be too late to reverse the damage. As I worked, late into the night, I found myself thinking about my father's note. "Follow your dreams, sweetheart." Well, Dad, I thought as I saved my files and closed my laptop, I'm about to do exactly that. You just never imagined that my dream would be watching your precious son destroy everything you built. 3 weeks had passed since David's consultant parade began dismantling our operations, and I was sitting in my car outside the downtown law offices of Harrison and Associates at 7 in the morning. The building was still dark except for a few scattered windows where early risers were already grinding through their billable hours. I checked my phone one more time to confirm the appointment. 8 o'clock sharp with Margaret Harrison, estate attorney and, more importantly, my father's secret legal counsel for the past 15 years. The call had come 2 days ago, completely out of nowhere. A crisp, professional voice on the other, and explaining that there were additional matters related to my father's estate that required immediate attention. Personal matters that needed to be discussed privately, away from the family's regular legal team. When I'd asked what kind of matters, Margaret had simply said, "The kind your father specifically instructed me not to discuss over the phone." Now, sitting in the early morning silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change again. The past few weeks had been a masterclass in corporate destruction. I'd watched David make every mistake I'd carefully guided him toward, seen the confusion and fear spreading through the office as the McKinsey consultants implemented their efficiency recommendations. 3 department heads had already resigned, including Marcus Chen, our head of quality control who'd been with the company for 18 years. But something was nagging at me, some detail that didn't quite fit. Yesterday, while helping the consultants review our financial records, I'd noticed something strange. There were monthly payments going to Harrison and Associates dating back to 2008, just after my mother's death. Substantial payments, the kind you'd make for ongoing legal services rather than occasional consultations. My father had never mentioned using any attorney other than Robert Pemberton, the family lawyer who'd handled his will. The building's lobby came alive with fluorescent lighting as I made my way to the elevator. Harrison and Associates occupied the entire 14th floor, their name etched in elegant gold lettering across frosted glass doors. The receptionist wasn't in yet, but a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp green eyes was waiting for me in the lobby area. "Sarah Mitchell?" She extended a firm handshake. "Margaret Harrison. Thank you for coming so early. I prefer to handle sensitive matters before the office gets busy." I followed her through a maze of leather-appointed hallways to a corner office that looked out over the city. The walls were lined with law books and framed certificates, but what caught my attention was a photograph on her desk. My father, looking younger and less tired than I remembered him in recent years, standing next to Margaret at what appeared to be some kind of legal ceremony. "You knew my father well," I observed, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Your father was one of my most valued clients," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "And more than that, he was someone I respected deeply, which is why what I'm about to tell you is so difficult." She opened a thick file folder and withdrew a document I'd never seen before. It looked official, with the kind of heavy paper and embossed seals that signified legal importance. But what made my breath catch was the date at the top. Just 6 months ago, 3 months before my father's death. "This is a codicil to your father's will," Margaret explained, sliding the document across the desk. "A legally binding amendment that supersedes certain provisions of the will that was read in Pemberton's office." My hands were trembling as I picked up the document. The legal language was dense and complex, but as I read through it, certain phrases jumped out at me. Secondary inheritance provision. Contingent ownership transfer. Performance-based redistribution of assets. "I don't understand," I said, looking up at Margaret. "What does this mean?" She leaned forward, her expression serious. It means your father anticipated exactly what has happened over the past 3 weeks. David's performance as CEO, the hiring of outside consultants, the systematic dismantling of company culture. Your father built multiple safeguards into his estate planning, but this particular provision was his insurance policy. I stared at the document, trying to process what she was telling me. What kind of insurance policy? The codicil establishes a performance review period of 60 days from the date David assumed control of the company. If, during that period, company performance declined by more than 15% across specific metrics: employee retention, client satisfaction, operational efficiency, and profit margins, then ownership of Mitchell Industries would automatically transfer to you. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had to read that section 3 times before it fully sank in. Transfer to me? But the will clearly stated. The will stated that David would inherit the company? Yes. But your father was a careful man, Sarah. He'd spent 40 years building Mitchell Industries, and he wasn't about to let it be destroyed by poor leadership, even if that leadership came from his own son. This codicil was his way of ensuring that the company would ultimately end up in the hands of whoever was best qualified to run it. I felt dizzy, like the office was tilting around me. How is this possible? Why wasn't this mentioned during the will reading? Margaret's expression grew grim. Because your father specifically instructed that this codicil only be revealed if David's performance triggered its conditions. He hoped it would never be necessary. He genuinely wanted David to succeed, but he also knew that hope and business, reality, don't always align. She pulled out another folder, this one filled with charts and graphs. I've been monitoring the company's performance since David took over, just as your father requested. The numbers are concerning. I looked at the data she'd compiled, and my heart sank. Employee turnover was up 38%. 3 major clients had already indicated they were considering switching to competitors. The stock price had dropped 12%. Profit margins were down 19%, largely due to the consultant fees and the disruption caused by their recommendations. We're past the threshold, I whispered. Significantly past it, Margaret confirmed. According to the terms of the codicil, you became the rightful owner of Mitchell Industries as of yesterday. I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. All this time, while I'd been plotting the company's destruction, my father had been plotting its salvation. While I'd been guiding David toward failure, the failure itself was guiding the company back to me. There's more, Margaret continued, opening yet another file. Your father left detailed instructions for this scenario. He anticipated that David's leadership might not only damage the company, but also put it at risk of hostile takeover or dissolution. If the codicil was triggered, he wanted you to have the resources necessary to repair the damage quickly. She handed me a bank statement that made my eyes widen, a private account containing $25 million, earmarked specifically for company recovery and modernization. Money that had been quietly moved out of the business over the years and invested separately, growing into a war chest that could fund whatever changes were necessary to restore Mitchell Industries to its former strength. How long have you known about this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I helped your father draft these documents 2 years ago, when David first started showing interest in joining the company. Your father loved his son, but he wasn't blind to his limitations. He saw how David approached business, the focus on short-term gains over long-term stability, the willingness to sacrifice company culture for impressive quarterly numbers. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying my face. He also saw how you approached business, the way you built relationships with employees and clients, your understanding of the company's core values, your commitment to sustainable growth rather than quick profits. He knew that if David failed, you would be the one to clean up the mess. I thought about all the nights I'd spent over the past 3 weeks, carefully documenting David's mistakes, building my case for why the company was failing under his leadership. I'd thought I was gathering ammunition for my own revenge plot. Instead, I'd been collecting evidence for my father's succession plan. But why not just leave the company to me in the first place? I asked. Why put everyone through this? Margaret's expression softened slightly. Because your father was a complicated man who lived in a complicated time. Part of him genuinely believed that David might rise to the occasion, that the responsibility of leadership might bring out qualities he hadn't shown before. And part of him— She paused, choosing her words carefully. Part of him was still influenced by traditional ideas about inheritance and family legacy. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. But the businessman in him, the part that had built an empire from nothing, that part knew exactly who should really be running Mitchell Industries. This codicil was his way of letting merit determine succession, rather than just bloodline and gender. I stared at the documents, spread across her desk, trying to process the magnitude of what I was learning. What happens now? How do we implement this? Very carefully, Margaret replied, returning to her seat. The codicil is legally ironclad, but David won't simply accept that he's lost the company. Neither will Linda, for that matter. They'll challenge it in court, claim your father wasn't of sound mind when he drafted it, argue that the performance metrics were impossible to meet. She pulled out a timeline she'd prepared. We need to move strategically. First, we'll need to document everything that's happened since David took over, create an undeniable record of declining performance. Then we'll need to prepare for the transition itself, identify which of David's changes can be quickly reversed and which will require more time to repair. I looked at the timeline, my mind already racing ahead to the challenges we'd face. The employees are going to be confused and demoralized. Some of the good ones have already left. The clients who are still with us are nervous about the company's direction. Which is why your father included provisions for retention bonuses and client relationship repair, Margaret said, pointing to another section of the codicil. He thought of everything, Sarah. The question is whether you're ready to implement his plan. I stood and walked to the window myself, looking down at the street below where people were beginning their morning commutes. Somewhere among those buildings was the Mitchell Industries headquarters, where David was probably right now, making more decisions that would further damage our father's legacy, where employees were wondering if their jobs would survive the next round of efficiency consultations, where clients were questioning whether they could still trust the company they'd worked with for decades. I've been ready my whole life, I said finally. I just didn't know it until now. Margaret smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from her since I'd arrived. Your father said you'd say something like that. He also said to give you this, when you were ready. She handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in my father's handwriting. Inside was a letter, shorter than the one David had received, but infinitely more meaningful. Sarah, it began, if you're reading this, it means David has failed as a leader, and the company is in trouble. It also means you're about to inherit a damaged business and the responsibility for fixing it. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for putting you through the pain of watching the will reading. Sorry for making you think I didn't value your contributions. And sorry for creating a situation where you had to prove yourself all over again. But I'm not sorry for giving you this opportunity. Leading a company in crisis is the ultimate test of business leadership. Anyone can maintain success. Not everyone can create it from chaos. I believe you can not only save Mitchell Industries, but make it stronger than it's ever been. The resources are there. The legal authority is yours. The knowledge and relationships you've built over the years will serve you well. But most importantly, you have something David never did. You understand that a company is more than just a financial entity. It's a community of people working toward common goals, and those people deserve leaders who value their contributions and protect their futures. Make me proud, sweetheart. But more than that, make yourself proud. I had to stop reading for a moment, blinking back tears that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with relief. My father had seen me, really seen me, in ways I'd never realized. He'd understood not just my capabilities, but my values. Not just my ambition, but my commitment to doing things the right way. "When do we tell David?" I asked Margaret. "We don't, not yet. First, we need to complete the documentation process and prepare for his inevitable legal challenge. I'll need you to provide detailed records of every decision he's made since taking over, every policy change, every consultant recommendation that's been implemented." I smiled, thinking about the files I'd been compiling over the past 3 weeks. "I have everything we need." "Good. Then we'll schedule a formal notification meeting for next week. David will have 72 hours to contest the codicil in court, but given the overwhelming evidence of declining performance, any judge will uphold your father's wishes." As I prepared to leave, Margaret handed me one final document. "Your father also wanted you to have this. It's a letter he wrote to the employees, to be read when you officially take over. He wanted them to understand why this transition was happening and what they could expect under your leadership." I took the letter but didn't open it. That would wait until I was alone, until I could fully process everything that had happened in this office. Walking back to my car, I felt like a completely different person than the one who had entered the building 2 hours earlier. This morning, I'd been Sarah Mitchell, the overlooked daughter plotting her brother's downfall. Now, I was Sarah Mitchell, future CEO of Mitchell Industries, inheritor of both a damaged company and the resources to repair it. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 weeks, I'd been working to sabotage David's leadership, thinking I was acting out of spite and revenge. Instead, I'd been unknowingly documenting the very evidence that would justify my father's succession plan. Every mistake I'd guided David toward, every failure I'd helped him achieve, had been building the case for my own inheritance. My father had played a longer game than any of us had realized. He'd given David enough rope to hang himself, knowing that if David was truly unfit for leadership, he would reveal that unfitness quickly and decisively. And he'd positioned me to be the solution to the problems David would create. As I drove toward the office, I thought about the challenges ahead: rebuilding employee morale, restoring client confidence, reversing the damage done by the consultants, proving to the board and shareholders that I could successfully lead the company. It would be the hardest thing I'd ever done, but for the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. David had no idea what was coming. He was probably sitting in our father's office right now, reviewing more consultant reports and planning additional efficiency measures. He thought he'd won the ultimate prize, inheriting control of a successful company without having to truly earn it. But success built on unearned privilege was always fragile. And David was about to learn that lesson in the most public and painful way possible. The company he thought he owned was about to be taken away from him, not through any corporate coup or family conspiracy, but through the simple application of business performance standards. My father had taught me many lessons over the years, but this was perhaps the most important. True leadership couldn't be inherited or appointed. It had to be demonstrated, earned through competence, and proven through results. David had failed that test, and now it was my turn to show what real leadership looked like. The best part was that I wouldn't have to destroy anything to prove my point. David had already done that work for me. All I had to do was step in and rebuild, using the very skills and relationships I'd spent years developing while he was learning. Golf. Justice, it turned out, had its own timeline, and mine was about to begin. The coffee shop on 5th Street had become my unofficial war room over the past 10 days. Every morning at 6:30, I claimed the corner table by the window where I could work undisturbed while keeping an eye on the street. The baristas knew my order by heart now. Large dark roast, extra shot, no sugar. Fuel for the most important project of my life. Spread across the small wooden table were 3 laptops, 2 phones, and enough legal documents to choke a horse. To anyone watching, I probably looked like a stressed graduate student cramming for finals. They had no idea I was orchestrating the most sophisticated corporate takeover in Mitchell Industries' 70-year history. Margaret Harrison had been right about needing meticulous documentation. The codicil was legally bulletproof, but David would fight it with everything he had. His attorneys would scrutinize every clause, challenge every performance metric, and argue that the standards were unreasonable or the timeline too short. My job was to make their arguments impossible to sustain. I'd spent the weekend creating a comprehensive timeline of every decision David had made since taking control. The McKinsey consultants had been thorough in their documentation, ironically, providing me with a detailed record of their own destructive recommendations. Every staff reduction, every policy change, every vendor renegotiation was logged with dates, justifications, and measurable outcomes. The numbers told a devastating story. In just 4 weeks, David had managed to undo relationships that had taken decades to build. Thompson Aerospace, our second largest client, had formally notified us that they were reviewing their contract. Pinnacle Manufacturing had delayed their next order pending evaluation of Mitchell Industries' ongoing reliability. Even smaller, clients were expressing concerns about our recent organizational changes. But it wasn't just external relationships that were crumbling. Internal damage was even more severe. The employee satisfaction survey that I'd quietly commissioned through an outside firm painted a picture of a workforce in crisis. Morale had plummeted 43% since David's first day. 71% of employees reported feeling uncertain about their job security. Most damaging of all, 68% said they were actively seeking employment elsewhere. I'd been particularly strategic about documenting the consultant-driven changes. McKinsey & Associates had recommended eliminating our apprenticeship program, the one that had trained 3 generations of skilled machinists and had been my father's pride and joy. They'd suggested outsourcing our quality control department to a third-party firm in Ohio, despite the fact that our in-house quality standards were considered the industry gold standard. They'd even proposed moving our customer service operations offshore, completely ignoring the fact that our clients valued direct communication with knowledgeable representatives who understood their specific needs. Each recommendation followed the same pattern: short-term cost savings that would inevitably lead to long-term revenue loss. David, dazzled by the projected quarterly improvements, had approved almost everything without considering the broader implications. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca, my former assistant who was now serving as my intelligence network inside the company. Emergency meeting called for this afternoon. David looks nervous. Something big is happening. I smiled as I typed back a quick response. Rebecca had no idea she was feeding information to the future owner of the company, but her updates had been invaluable in timing my next moves. If David was calling emergency meetings, it meant the pressure was finally getting to him. The truth was, I'd been applying that pressure systematically, not through sabotage or obvious interference, but through strategic use of my relationships and industry knowledge. A quiet word with certain clients about alternative suppliers, casual conversations with key employees about opportunities at competitor firms, subtle questions to vendors about payment schedules and contract renewals. I wasn't destroying anything directly. I was simply accelerating the natural consequences of David's poor decisions, helping the market respond more quickly to the changes he'd implemented. If Mitchell Industries was becoming unreliable, clients needed to know sooner rather than later. If employees were being devalued, they deserved to understand their options. The most elegant aspect of my strategy was its passive nature. I wasn't actively harming the company so much as withdrawing the protective influence I'd been providing for years. For nearly a decade, I'd been the unofficial buffer between management mistakes and their consequences. I'd smoothed over client concerns, addressed employee complaints before they escalated, and found creative solutions to operational problems. Now I was simply stepping back. Without my intervention, every one of David's missteps rippled outward with full force. When the quality control outsourcing created shipping delays, I didn't quietly rearrange schedules to minimize impact. When consultant-recommended staff cuts left departments understaffed, I didn't volunteer to work overtime covering the gaps. When client complaints started flooding in, I didn't use my relationships to provide damage control. For the first time in years, Mitchell Industries was experiencing the true cost of poor leadership without anyone cleaning up the mess behind the scenes. My second laptop chimed with an email from Marcus Chen, the quality control director who'd resigned in protest over the outsourcing decision. Marcus had been my father's hire, brought in 12 years ago to establish the quality standards that had become our competitive advantage. His resignation had sent shockwaves through both our workforce and our client base. "Sarah," his email began, "I hope you're doing well after everything that's happened. I wanted you to know that I've been contacted by several former colleagues asking about opportunities at my new company. The word is spreading that Mitchell Industries isn't the same place it used to be. I thought you should know, since you always cared about the people there." I stared at the screen, feeling a mixture of sadness and vindication. Marcus was right that I cared about the people, which made watching the company's decline especially painful. But I also knew that sometimes you had to let something fall apart completely before you could rebuild it properly. The attached file contained something even more valuable than his concern: a detailed analysis of how the quality control outsourcing was already affecting production standards. Defect rates had increased by 37% in just 2 weeks. Customer complaints were up 60%. 2 major orders had been delayed due to quality issues that would never have occurred under Marcus's oversight. This was exactly the kind of documentation Margaret Harrison needed to prove that David's leadership was causing measurable harm to the company's operations. I forwarded the information to her immediately, along with a note explaining Marcus's background and credibility. My phone rang, interrupting my email review. The caller ID showed Linda's name, and I considered letting it go to voicemail. My stepmother and I had barely spoken since the will reading, and I couldn't imagine she had anything pleasant to say. But curiosity won out. "Sarah, darling." Linda's voice was sickeningly sweet, which usually meant she wanted something. "I hope you're adjusting well to your new circumstances. I know this transition has been difficult for everyone." "I'm managing fine, Linda. What can I do for you?" "Well, I was hoping we could have lunch today. Just the 2 of us. Family too." Family. There are some things I think we should discuss. I glanced at my calendar, which was packed with preparation work for the coming confrontation. But Linda's sudden interest in family bonding was suspicious enough to warrant investigation. "I suppose I could spare an hour." "Where did you have in mind?" "The Riverside Club. 1 o'clock? I already made reservations." The Riverside Club was the kind of establishment where wealthy people went to have conversations they didn't want overheard. Private dining rooms, discreet staff, and the kind of ambient noise that made eavesdropping impossible. Whatever Linda wanted to discuss, she was taking it seriously. I arrived at the club 10 minutes early, using the time to observe the environment and choose my seating strategically. Linda was already waiting in a corner booth, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon light, and her designer dress announcing her status to anyone who cared to notice. "Sarah, you look wonderful," she said, standing to embrace me with the kind of calculated warmth she'd perfected over the years. "I'm so glad we could do this." We made small talk through the appetizer course, dancing around the real purpose of our meeting. Linda asked about my apartment, my social life, my plans for the future. All perfectly normal questions that felt like reconnaissance. Finally, over the main course, she revealed her hand. "I'll be direct, Sarah. David is struggling with some aspects of running the company. The transition has been more challenging than anyone anticipated." I nodded sympathetically while cutting my salmon. Change is always difficult. I'm sure he'll find his footing. The consultants have been helpful, but they don't understand the company culture the way someone from the family would. David needs support from people who truly understand what your father built. That makes sense. Has he considered reaching out to some of the longtime employees for guidance? Linda's smile tightened slightly. Actually, that's why I wanted to speak with you. David is too proud to ask directly, but he needs your help. Your knowledge of the operations, your relationships with clients and staff, he's hoping you might consider taking on a more significant role in the company. I set down my fork and studied Linda's face. This was interesting. David was clearly in over his head, and Linda was smart enough to recognize that his failure would affect her comfortable lifestyle. But rather than admitting weakness, they were trying to frame my assistance as some kind of favor to me. What kind of role are you talking about? Vice President of Operations. Real authority, real decision-making, power. David recognizes that he needs someone he can trust in a senior position. The irony was almost overwhelming. 4 weeks ago, they dismissed me as unqualified for leadership. Now they were begging me to save them from the consequences of that decision. But they still weren't offering me what I actually deserved, just enough authority to clean up David's mess while he maintained ultimate control. That's very generous, I said carefully. But I've been exploring other opportunities since leaving Mitchell Industries. I'm not sure I'm ready to go backward. Linda leaned forward, her composure cracking slightly. Sarah, be realistic. Do you really think you'll find anything comparable elsewhere? Mitchell Industries is your family legacy. Where else are you going to have that kind of connection and influence? You'd be surprised what's available to someone with my experience and track record. That wasn't entirely true. I hadn't actually been job hunting since I'd been too busy preparing to reclaim my birthright. But Linda didn't need to know that. Look, Linda's voice took on a harder edge. I know you're upset about the will, but your father made his decision, and fighting it won't change anything. The smart thing to do is work with David, help him, succeed, and benefit from that success. I smiled politely while my mind processed her desperation. If Linda was this worried about David's performance, it meant the situation was even worse than my documentation suggested. She was genuinely afraid that he was going to destroy the company, which would eliminate her access to the lifestyle she'd become accustomed to. I appreciate the offer, Linda. I really do. But I need some time to think about it. How much time? A few days. This is a big decision. Linda nodded, though I could see the frustration in her eyes. She'd expected me to jump at the chance to return to the company, especially with the promise of a higher position. The fact that I was hesitant clearly worried her. Of course, take all the time you need. But Sarah, please remember that family should support each other. Your father would have wanted us to work together. The mention of my father almost made me laugh out loud. If Linda only knew what my father had actually wanted, she'd probably faint right there in the Riverside Club dining room. After lunch, I drove directly to Margaret Harrison's office. Linda's offer had confirmed something important. David was already desperate enough to swallow his pride and ask for help. That desperation would make him more likely to make additional mistakes, and it also suggested that the company's problems were becoming visible to outsiders. This is actually perfect timing, Margaret said after I'd related the conversation. If David is reaching out through intermediaries, it means he's aware that his leadership is failing, but he's not sure why. That kind of confusion often leads to panic decisions. She pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before, thick with legal documents and corporate filings. I've been researching David's background more thoroughly, and I found something interesting. During his MBA program, he wrote a thesis on rapid corporate restructuring. His basic philosophy is that companies can be optimized quickly through aggressive cost-cutting and operational streamlining. That explains the consultants, I said. Exactly. But here's the problem with his approach. It only works for companies that are genuinely inefficient or bloated. Mitchell Industries wasn't either of those things. Your father had already optimized operations over 4 decades of gradual improvement. What David is calling inefficiency is actually just the cost of maintaining quality and building relationships. Margaret handed me a copy of David's thesis, and I flipped through it with growing understanding. His entire business philosophy was based on MBA case studies of companies that had been poorly managed and needed dramatic intervention. He'd never learned how to lead a well-functioning organization, so he was applying crisis management techniques to a company that hadn't been in crisis. He's not just making bad decisions, I realized. He's making bad decisions based on a fundamentally flawed understanding of what the company needed. Which makes him completely predictable, Margaret agreed. If we can anticipate his next moves based on his stated philosophy, we can be ready with documentation of why those moves will fail. She showed me David's thesis outline, which read like a roadmap for everything that had gone wrong over the past month. Eliminate redundancies. Standardize processes. Outsource non-core functions. Reduce overhead through staff optimization. Every consultant recommendation had come straight from his business school playbook. What's his next step likely to be? I asked. Margaret pointed to a section of the thesis titled Stakeholder Management in Crisis Situations. David's recommendation was to maintain confidence through aggressive communication strategies and to present short-term improvements as evidence of long-term success. He's going to try to spin the current problems as temporary growing pains, she said. Probably call a stakeholder meeting to reassure clients and investors that everything is under control. I thought about Rebecca's text about the emergency meeting. I think that's already happening. Perfect. Let him dig himself deeper. The more public his failure becomes, the stronger our case for implementing the codicil. As I left Margaret's office, I felt the pieces of my father's plan clicking into place with mathematical precision. David wasn't just failing as a leader. He was failing in exactly the ways my father had anticipated. The codicil hadn't just been insurance against poor performance. It had been insurance against specific types of poor performance that my father had recognized as David's likely weaknesses. My father had known his son better than David knew himself. He'd understood that David's MBA training would make him overconfident in textbook solutions, that his lack of operational experience would make him vulnerable to consultant manipulation, and that his need to prove himself would lead him to make dramatic changes without understanding their consequences. The brilliant cruelty of it was that David was destroying himself using the very tools he thought made him qualified to lead. His business education, his strategic thinking, his decisive leadership style, all of it was working against him because he was applying it to the wrong situation. And I was there to document every mistake, every miscalculation, every moment of hubris that brought him closer to losing everything he thought he'd inherited. The next morning, I returned to my corner table at the coffee shop with renewed focus. Today, I would finalize the timeline that would serve as evidence for David's removal. Tomorrow, Margaret would file the formal notification with the court. By the end of the week, David would discover that inheriting a company and deserving it were 2 very different things. My father had taught me patience, strategy, and the importance of long-term thinking. Now, I was finally getting the chance to put all those lessons into practice. The boardroom felt different at 7 in the morning, empty and sterile, with morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table where so many of my father's most important decisions had been made. I stood at the head of the table, adjusting the stack of documents Margaret Harrison had prepared, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. In exactly 30 minutes, David would walk through those doors expecting another, routine board meeting. He had no idea that his world was about to implode in the most spectacular and legally binding way possible. Margaret sat to my right, her briefcase open and every document organized with military precision. Across from her, Robert Pemberton looked uncomfortable and slightly betrayed. The family's longtime attorney had been blindsided by the codicil, revelation just as much as everyone else, and his professional pride was clearly wounded by having been kept out of such a significant legal arrangement. "I still don't understand why Thomas didn't include me in this planning," Pemberton muttered for the third time since arriving. 40 years of legal service, and he goes behind my back with contingency documents. "Because he needed someone David wouldn't suspect," Margaret replied patiently. "You were the obvious choice for the primary will, which meant you couldn't be involved in the backup plan. Thomas was protecting both the arrangement and your reputation." The boardroom door opened, and David strode in with his usual confidence, followed by Linda and 3 of the Mackenzie consultants. He'd clearly expected this to be another strategic planning session, another opportunity to showcase his leadership vision to the board members who would be arriving shortly. "Sarah?" David stopped short when he saw me at the head of the table. "What are you doing here?" "This is a closed board meeting." "Sit down, David." My voice was calm, controlled, carrying just enough authority to make him pause. "We have some things to discuss before the others arrive." Linda moved closer to David's side, her face already showing signs of concern. She'd always been good at reading situations, and something about the formal arrangement of documents and the presence of 2 attorneys was clearly setting off her alarm bells. "If this is about the VP position we discussed," David said, still standing, "we can handle that conversation later. Right now, I need to prepare for a presentation to the board about our quarterly improvements." "There won't be any presentation today," I said, gesturing again to the chairs across from me. "Please, sit down, both of you." Margaret opened her briefcase and withdrew the codicil, placing it on the table with deliberate ceremony. The official seals and legal formatting were immediately recognizable, and I watched David's expression shift from confusion to something approaching alarm. "What is this?" Linda asked, her voice tight. "This is a legally binding amendment to your father's will," Margaret replied, her tone professional and neutral. "A codicil that establishes performance-based conditions for the inheritance of Mitchell Industries." David finally sat down, his face pale. "Performance-based conditions? That's impossible. The will was clear. I inherited the company outright." "You inherited the company conditionally," I corrected. "The will you heard at Robert's office was accurate but incomplete. Dad created a 60-day performance review period with specific metrics that had to be maintained for your inheritance to remain valid." I slid a copy of the codicil across the table to David, watching his eyes scan the legal language. His MBA training was probably helping him understand the implications faster than he wanted to. "Employee retention above 85%. I continued, reading from my own copy. "Client satisfaction scores maintained within 5% of baseline. Profit margins sustained within 10% of previous quarterly averages. Stock price stability within 15% variance." Linda leaned over David's shoulder, reading along with increasing horror. "This is ridiculous. Thomas never mentioned any of this." "Because he hoped it would never be necessary," Margaret said. "But it was his insurance policy against poor leadership destroying what he'd spent a lifetime building." David looked up from the document, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "This is some kind of legal trick. Dad wouldn't have done this. He trusted me with the company." "He trusted you to earn it," I replied, "and you failed." I opened the first folder Margaret had prepared, revealing the comprehensive performance analysis we'd compiled over the past 6 weeks. Charts and graphs painted a devastating picture of David's leadership, with every metric falling well below the codicil's requirements. "Employee retention is down 38%, I said, pointing to the relevant chart. "You've lost 47 key personnel, including 3 department heads and our entire apprenticeship class. Client satisfaction has dropped 42%, with 2 major accounts already indicating they're seeking alternative suppliers." David's hands were shaking as he flipped through the pages. These numbers are skewed. You can't judge leadership effectiveness over just 6 weeks. Any transition period involves some temporary disruption. Temporary disruption doesn't typically result in a 23% drop in stock price, Margaret interjected, producing another set of documents. Or a 31% decline in new contract acquisitions. Linda stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. This is a setup. Sarah has been sabotaging David from the beginning, hasn't she? She's been undermining him to create these failures. I met her accusation with calm directness. I've been documenting his failures, not creating them. Every decision that led to these results was made by David or his consultants. I simply stopped protecting him from the consequences. Protecting me? David's voice rose. What's that supposed to mean? It means that for 6 years, I've been the buffer between management mistakes and their impact, I said. When vendor relationships got strained, I smoothed things over. When employees had complaints, I addressed them before they escalated. When operational problems arose, I found solutions before they affected productivity. I pulled out another folder, this one containing emails and internal communications dating back years. Since you took over, I stopped providing that protection. I let every mistake you made have its full natural consequences. Nothing more, nothing less. The truth of it was hitting David now, and I could see him mentally reviewing the past 6 weeks, recognizing how many small crises had suddenly felt much larger than they should have. You had no right, he said, his voice barely controlled. This company belongs to me. Dad left it to me. Dad left it to whoever could successfully run it, I corrected. And according to every measurable standard, that's not you. Margaret placed another document on the table. As of yesterday, all performance thresholds established in the codicil have been exceeded. Legally and irrevocably, ownership of Mitchell Industries transfers to Sarah Mitchell, effective immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. David stared at the document as if he could will it out of existence through sheer force of denial. Linda sank back into her chair, her face white with shock. "This won't stand up in court," David finally said, his voice hollow. "I'll challenge it. This whole setup is fraudulent." "You're welcome to try," Margaret replied. "But the codicil is legally ironclad. The performance metrics are objective and verifiable, and the timeline was clearly established before you took control. No court will overturn a document this thoroughly documented and legitimately executed." Robert Pemberton, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "David, I've reviewed the codicil thoroughly. It's valid. Your father had every legal right to structure his estate this way." "You're supposed to be the family lawyer," David snapped. "Whose side are you on?" "I'm on the side of legal validity and proper estate execution," Pemberton replied stiffly. "Personal feelings don't override legal reality." I stood, walking, to the window that overlooked the factory floor. 3 floors below, I could see employees beginning their shifts, unaware that their workplace was about to undergo another dramatic change in leadership. "David, you have a choice to make," I said without turning around. "You can accept this transition gracefully and work with me to repair the damage that's been done. Or you can fight it publicly and make the situation even worse for everyone involved." "Work with you?" His voice was bitter. "You've been plotting against me from the moment Dad died." I turned back to face him. "I've been preparing for the possibility that you would fail. There's a difference." Linda was frantically scrolling through her phone, probably already calling their personal attorney. "We're not just going to roll over and accept this," she said. "There has to be some way to challenge the metrics or the timeline." "The timeline was established in the codicil itself," Margaret said. "The metrics were based on industry standards and Mitchell Industries' historical performance. Everything is objective and measurable." I returned to my seat and opened one final folder. David, I want you to understand something. This isn't about revenge or sibling rivalry. This is about saving a company that 3 generations of our family have built. I showed him a projection analysis Margaret's team had prepared. If current trends continue under your leadership, Mitchell Industries will be insolvent within 18 months. The consultant fees alone are eating into profit margins faster than revenue can sustain. Employee turnover costs are skyrocketing. Client defection is accelerating. The projections were stark and undeniable, based on the actual trajectory of David's first 6 weeks extrapolated over time. Even David's MBA training couldn't argue with the mathematical reality of compound decline. But if we act now, I continued, most of the damage can be reversed. Key employees can be convinced to return. Client relationships can be rebuilt. The company can not only survive but thrive under proper leadership. David looked at the projections, his face cycling through anger, denial, and finally something approaching understanding. For the first time since the meeting began, he seemed to grasp the full scope of what his leadership had cost. How? He asked quietly. How do you reverse this kind of damage? By remembering what made Mitchell Industries successful in the first place, I said. Quality products, reliable relationships, and treating employees like valuable assets rather than expendable resources. I pulled out my phone and showed him a text I'd received that morning from Marcus Chen, the quality control director who'd resigned. Marcus wants to come back. So do half the people who left. They didn't quit the company, David. They quit your leadership. Linda was still on her phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to what was probably their lawyer. But David seemed to be processing the reality of his situation, understanding for the first time that his inheritance had been conditional rather than guaranteed. The consultant said these changes would improve efficiency, he said, almost to himself. The consultants were paid to recommend changes, so they recommended changes, I replied. That's what consultants do. But Mitchell Industries didn't need dramatic restructuring. It needed careful stewardship. Margaret checked her watch. The board members will be arriving soon. We need to decide how to handle the transition announcement. I looked at David, seeing my brother clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Underneath the arrogance and entitlement, I could see the fear and confusion of someone who'd been given responsibility he wasn't prepared for and had failed spectacularly. You can be part of the solution, David, I said. You have skills and knowledge that could be valuable if applied correctly. But you can't be the CEO. The numbers prove that conclusively. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across the table. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, genuine humility. What happens now? He asked. Now we tell the board what's happened and begin the process of repairing the company, I said. Together, if you're willing. Linda snapped her phone shut. Our attorney says we should contest this immediately. File an injunction to prevent any leadership changes until the codicil can be properly challenged. That's your right, Margaret said. But I should warn you that any legal challenge will become public record. The business community will know that Mitchell Industries is in leadership crisis, which will further damage client confidence and stock value. I could see David weighing his options. Fight the transition publicly and risk destroying what was left of the company's reputation, or accept the reality and try to salvage something from the situation. The boardroom door opened, and the first board members began to arrive. Patricia. Walsh, the longest-serving member and one of my father's oldest friends, took one look at the scene and immediately understood that something significant was happening. Good morning, she said carefully, taking her usual seat. Should we expect any surprises today? I stood and smiled at Patricia, feeling a mixture of nervousness and determination. As a matter of fact, yes. We have some important changes to announce regarding company leadership. David looked at me one more time, and I saw him make his decision. His shoulders sagged slightly as he nodded, the fight going out of him. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said as the rest of the board filed in, "thank you for being here on such short notice. We have some significant developments to discuss regarding the future of Mitchell Industries." Margaret opened her briefcase and began distributing copies of the codicil to each board member. The room grew quiet as they read, understanding slowly dawning on their faces. "As you can see," I continued, "my father's estate planning included provisions that we weren't previously aware of. Based on objective performance metrics over the past 60 days, I am now the rightful owner and CEO of Mitchell Industries." Patricia Walsh looked up from her copy, her expression unreadable. "These performance standards, they've all been exceeded?" "Significantly," Margaret confirmed, handing out the supporting documentation. "Every metric established in the codicil shows performance below acceptable thresholds." Board member James Crawford, a man who'd known our family since I was a child, studied the numbers with the careful attention of someone who understood their implications. "Sarah," he said finally, "assuming these documents are valid, what's your plan for addressing these performance issues?" I looked around the table at faces I'd known for years, people who'd watched me grow up in this company, and felt the full weight of the responsibility I was about to accept. "We're going to rebuild," I said, "starting today." 6 months later, I stood in the exact same spot where my father had once delivered his monthly addresses to the company. But everything else had changed. The employee cafeteria was packed with faces both familiar and new, a mixture of returning veterans and fresh talent who'd heard that Mitchell Industries was becoming the kind of place people actually wanted to work again. The morning light streamed through windows that had been professionally cleaned for the first time in months, illuminating a room that buzzed with the kind of energy I remembered from my childhood visits to the factory. People were talking, laughing, sharing ideas across departmental lines that had been rigidly enforced under David's consultant-driven restructuring. I adjusted the wireless microphone clipped to my navy blazer and smiled at the crowd. These monthly all-hands meetings had become something I genuinely looked forward to, a chance to connect directly with every person who made our success possible. No corporate jargon, no filtered messages through middle management, just honest communication about where we stood and where we were headed. "Good morning, everyone," I began, and the room gradually quieted. "I know some of you have been wondering about the announcement teased in this week's company newsletter, so I'll get straight to the point. Yesterday, we received confirmation that Mitchell Industries has been selected as the primary supplier for the Morrison Aerospace Lunar Habitat Project." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. The Morrison contract represented the largest single order in company history, a 3-year, $120 million commitment that would secure jobs and growth for the foreseeable future. More importantly, it validated everything we'd rebuilt over the past 6 months. "This contract didn't happen by accident," I continued as the applause died down. "Morrison chose us because of our quality standards, our reliability, and our ability to deliver complex projects on time and within budget. In other words, they chose us because of who we are as a company and as a team." I looked out over the crowd, making eye contact with faces that told the story of our transformation. Marcus Chen sat in the front row, his quality control department fully restored and expanded. Jessica Torres, who'd been promoted from line supervisor to production manager, was taking notes for her team. Even some of the younger employees who'd been hired in recent months looked engaged and invested in ways that would have been impossible under the previous regime. 6 months ago, we were hemorrhaging talent, losing clients, and watching our reputation crumble. Today, we're not just back to where we were. We're stronger than we've ever been. That didn't happen because of magic or luck. It happened because of choices. The choice to value people over profit margins. The choice to prioritize long-term relationships over short-term cost savings. The choice to remember that a company, is only as good as the people who believe in its mission. The transformation hadn't been easy or automatic. Those first weeks after taking control had been the most challenging of my professional life. David, to his credit, had honored his agreement to support the transition publicly, but the damage he'd caused required immediate and decisive action. My first priority had been stopping the bleeding. The McKinsey consultants were dismissed within hours of my taking control, their half-implemented recommendations abandoned before they could cause additional harm. The outsourced quality control arrangement was terminated immediately, with Marcus Chen returning as department head the same day. The apprenticeship program was not only restored, but expanded, with additional funding allocated for advanced training and certification programs. But the real work had been rebuilding trust. Employees who'd watched their colleagues get laid off in the name of efficiency needed proof that the new leadership valued stability over spreadsheet optimization. Clients who'd seen service quality decline needed evidence that Mitchell Industries could once again be relied upon for consistent excellence. The proof had come through actions rather than words. When Thomson Aerospace expressed concerns about delivery timelines, I personally flew to their headquarters in Seattle to discuss their needs and tour their facilities. When our machine operators suggested improvements to the production line layout, we implemented their recommendations and gave them credit for the resulting efficiency gains. When longtime supplier relationships needed repair, I spent weeks rebuilding trust through face-to-face meetings and transparent communication about our renewed commitment to partnership. "I want to share some numbers with you," I said, clicking to the first slide of my presentation. "Not because I think you need convincing, but because you deserve to know how your efforts are translating into measurable success." The slide showed employee retention rates, and the improvement was dramatic. From a low of 62% during David's final month, we'd climbed to 94% retention, the highest in company history. More importantly, exit interview feedback had shifted from complaints about leadership and uncertainty to rare instances of people leaving for genuine career advancement opportunities elsewhere. Client satisfaction scores have returned to pre-transition levels and are continuing to climb. We've not only retained all our major accounts, but added 6 new clients who specifically cited our reputation for quality and reliability as their primary reason for choosing us. The financial numbers were equally impressive. Revenue was up 37% compared to the same period the previous year. Profit margins had recovered and exceeded historical averages. Stock price had not only stabilized but reached new highs as investor confidence returned. But the statistic I was most proud of was one that wouldn't appear on any financial report. Internal promotion rates had increased by 68%. We were growing our own leaders, recognizing talent regardless of where it originated, and creating career paths that rewarded competence and dedication rather than politics and favoritism. These improvements didn't happen in isolation, I continued. They happened because we remembered something fundamental about business success. Companies don't compete, people do. Products don't build relationships, humans do. And quality doesn't emerge from processes. It comes from craftspeople who take pride in their work. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph taken during our recent company picnic. Families gathered around picnic tables, children playing on the grass, employees from different departments talking and laughing together. It was the kind of scene that had been unimaginable during the consultant-driven efficiency era. We've also made some important structural changes that I want you to know about. Effective next month, we're implementing a profit-sharing program that will distribute 20% of annual profits directly to employees based on tenure and performance. We're expanding our healthcare benefits to include comprehensive family coverage, and we're establishing a community investment fund that will support local education and workforce development programs. The applause this time was longer and more heartfelt. These weren't cosmetic changes designed to improve employee satisfaction surveys. They were fundamental alterations to how the company operated, recognition that sustainable success required genuine investment in the people who made that success possible. After the meeting, I walked through the factory floor, something I did at least twice a week. It was a practice my father had maintained throughout his tenure, and I'd discovered it was one of the most valuable uses of my time. You couldn't understand the real challenges and opportunities of the business from a corner office. You had to see the work being done, hear the concerns of the people doing it, and stay connected to the actual production of value that kept the company viable. "Sarah, you got a minute?" Marcus Chen approached as I finished observing a particularly complex machining operation. "I wanted to talk to you about something." We stepped into his office, a space that had been completely reorganized since his return. Where the previous temporary quality control manager had maintained sterile efficiency, Marcus had restored the collaborative atmosphere that made his department effective. Whiteboards covered in process diagrams, comfortable chairs for extended problem-solving sessions, and photographs of successful projects that reminded everyone why quality mattered. "The Morrison contract is going to require some capability expansion," Marcus said, pulling out preliminary specifications. "The precision requirements for their habitat components are beyond anything we've handled before. We're talking about tolerances measured in microns, not millimeters." I studied the technical requirements, immediately understanding both the challenge and the opportunity. "What do you need?" "New equipment, definitely. But more importantly, we need people. The skill level required for this kind of precision work isn't something you can train quickly. We're looking at 6 to 12 months of intensive development for our most experienced operators. Budget? $2.7 million for equipment, another $800,000 for training and certification programs. Plus, we'll need to expand the quality control lab and hire 3 additional inspectors with aerospace experience." The investment was substantial, but I'd learned from watching David's tenure that short-term thinking was a luxury successful companies couldn't afford. "Do it. Whatever you need to deliver on this contract at the quality level Morrison expects." Marcus smiled, the kind of expression that came from working with leadership that understood the relationship between investment and capability. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already identified the equipment we need and reached out to 3 candidates for the inspector positions." As I left Marcus's office, I reflected on how different these conversations had become. Under David's leadership, every request for investment had been subjected to elaborate cost-benefit analyses and consultant approval. Decisions that should have taken days stretched into weeks while opportunities slipped away. Now, when competent people identified legitimate needs, they got the resources necessary to do their jobs properly. The afternoon brought a different kind of meeting, one that had become increasingly common as word spread about Mitchell Industries' transformation. Jennifer Walsh, CEO of Aurora Manufacturing, had requested a private conversation about potential partnership opportunities. Aurora was one of our competitors, but they were also facing challenges that sounded familiar. "I'll be direct, Sarah," Jennifer said as we sat in my office. "We're interested in how you've managed to turn things around so quickly. 6 months ago, industry analysts were writing Mitchell's obituary. Now you're landing contracts we can't even bid on competitively." I poured coffee for both of us, choosing my words carefully. Jennifer and I had known each other for years through industry associations, and I respected her straightforwardness. "We stopped trying to optimize our way to success and started investing our way to growth," I said. "Turns out that when you treat people like assets rather than expenses, they perform like assets. Your employee retention numbers are making the rest of us look bad," Jennifer said with a wry smile. "My HR director keeps asking why we can't achieve similar results. What does she think the difference is? Leadership philosophy, mostly. You've created an environment where people want to contribute rather than just collect paychecks. We're still stuck in the old model of managing through fear and control." It was an honest assessment, and one that highlighted how rare, genuine leadership had become in our industry. Too many companies were still operating under the assumption that employees were interchangeable resources rather than the actual source of competitive advantage. The irony is that treating people well turns out to be incredibly profitable, I said. Our productivity is up, our error rates are down, our innovation pipeline is stronger than it's been in years, and it's all because people feel valued and heard. Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. Any advice for someone trying to make similar changes? Start by listening, really listening, not just waiting for your turn to talk. Find out what's actually happening on the ground level, what's working, what isn't, and what people need to do their best work. Then act on what you learn, even if it contradicts conventional wisdom or costs money in the short term. We talked for another hour about specific strategies and implementation challenges. By the time Jennifer left, I could see her mental wheels turning, already planning how to apply some of these principles at Aurora. Industry-wide improvement would ultimately benefit everyone by raising standards and attracting better talent to manufacturing careers. The evening brought me back to my father's office, now fully transformed into a space that reflected my own leadership style while honoring his legacy. The massive oak desk remained, but it was now surrounded by comfortable seating areas where informal meetings could happen. The walls displayed photographs of employees and their families alongside images of our most successful projects. My father's portrait still hung behind the desk, not as a shrine but as a reminder of the values that had built this company. I was reviewing plans for the new employee wellness center when David knocked on the open door. These visits had become a weekly ritual, opportunities for us to coordinate on his transition into a role that actually suited his skills and interests. "How did the Morrison announcement go?" he asked, settling into one of the chairs across from my desk. "Better than expected." The whole room lit up when I mentioned the job security and growth opportunities it represents. David nodded, though I could see mixed emotions in his expression. The success of the company under my leadership was validation of our father's decision, but it was also a constant reminder of his own failure as CEO. "I finished the market analysis for the European expansion," he said, handing me a thick folder. "The opportunity is definitely there, but the regulatory complexity is going to require careful planning." Over the past 6 months, David had found his niche in strategic development and market research. His MBA training and analytical skills were valuable when applied to projects that played to his strengths, rather than areas that required operational leadership. The European expansion was his initiative, a carefully researched plan for establishing Mitchell Industries' presence in markets that valued our quality standards and manufacturing capabilities. "Your timeline projections look conservative," I said, flipping through his analysis. "Are you factoring in potential acceleration if the Morrison contract generates the kind of industry attention we're expecting?" I built in some flexibility for that scenario, but I'd rather underpromise and overdeliver than commit to timelines we can't meet. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful, measured approach that made David valuable in his current role. He'd learned hard lessons about the difference between confident leadership and reckless overcommitment. "Linda seems to be adjusting well to the changes," I observed. Since the transition, my stepmother had been notably absent from company affairs, focusing instead on charitable work and social activities that didn't require her to navigate the awkwardness of my elevated position. "She's found her own path," David said diplomatically. "The garden club keeps her busy, and she's gotten involved with the Children's Hospital fundraising committee. I think she's happier not having to worry about business decisions." It was probably true. Linda had never shown genuine interest in Mitchell Industries beyond what it could provide for her lifestyle. Now that the company was stable and profitable under different leadership, she could enjoy the benefits without having to pretend investment in the operations. "Any regrets?" I asked, the question that had been unspoken between us for months. David was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "About losing the CEO position?" Honestly, no. I was drowning, Sarah. I just didn't want to admit it. Watching you these past 6 months, seeing how naturally you handle the responsibility, it's obvious that Dad made the right call. He paused, looking out the window at the parking lot where employees were heading home after another productive day. My regret is that it took me so long to understand what leadership actually requires. I thought it was about making decisive decisions and driving change. I didn't realize it was about serving other people's success and creating conditions where good work could happen. It was perhaps the most honest conversation we'd ever had, certainly the most honest since our father's death. The rivalry and resentment that had characterized our relationship for years had been replaced by something approaching mutual respect. You're a good strategic thinker, David, and you're learning to be a good collaborator. Those are valuable skills, and they're making a real contribution to the company's success. Thanks. That means a lot coming from you. As David prepared to leave, he turned back one more time. Dad would be proud of what you've built here. Not just the financial results, but the culture, the way people feel about coming to work. That's the legacy he really cared about. After he left, I spent a few more minutes reviewing the European expansion proposal. David's research was thorough and his recommendations sound. More importantly, his approach reflected the kind of long-term thinking that would serve the company well as we continued to grow. The transformation of Mitchell Industries hadn't just been about reversing David's mistakes or restoring previous levels of performance. It had been about creating something better than what had existed before, learning from both success and failure to build a more resilient and adaptable organization. The profit-sharing program was generating ideas and innovations from every level of the company. Employees who felt invested in the outcome were identifying efficiency improvements, quality enhancements, and cost savings that no consultant could have discovered. The apprenticeship expansion was creating a pipeline of skilled workers who understood both the technical requirements and the cultural values that made Mitchell Industries distinctive. Most importantly, we'd proven that treating people well wasn't just morally right, it was strategically smart. Companies that invested in their employees, clients, and communities created competitive advantages that couldn't be easily replicated or undermined. My father's gamble had paid off in ways even he probably hadn't anticipated. By creating conditions that would reveal both David's limitations and my capabilities, he'd ensured that the company would end up with leadership that could not only preserve his legacy, but expand on it. The codicil hadn't just been about succession planning. It had been about transformation, forcing everyone involved to confront the difference between inherited privilege and earned authority. David had learned valuable lessons about leadership and found roles that suited his actual strengths. I had discovered that my years of preparation and relationship building had created the foundation for genuine executive capability. As I turned off the office lights and prepared to head home, I thought about the employees who would return tomorrow to continue building something meaningful, the clients who trusted us with their most important projects, and the community that benefited from our success. The responsibility was enormous, but it was also exactly what I'd been preparing for my entire career. My father had given me the ultimate gift, the opportunity to prove that leadership could be both profitable and principled, that success could be measured in more than just quarterly earnings, and that a company could be a force for positive change rather than just wealth extraction. The next morning would bring new challenges, fresh opportunities, and the ongoing work of building something worth inheriting. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. 2 years had passed since I first walked into that law office and discovered my father's true intentions, and this morning I found myself standing in the Mitchell Industries lobby, watching our newest batch of apprentices receive their certification certificates. 23 young people, ranging from recent high school graduates to career changers seeking new opportunities, beaming with pride as they completed a program that guaranteed them not just jobs, but careers with genuine advancement potential. The apprenticeship program had become something of a local legend. What started as a restoration of my father's original vision had evolved into a comprehensive workforce development initiative that attracted attention from manufacturers across 3 states. We'd partnered with community colleges, technical schools, and even the state university to create educational pathways that combined practical skills with theoretical knowledge. Sarah, the documentary crew is ready for the final interview segment, Rebecca informed me, approaching with her usual efficiency. My former assistant had become our director of communications, overseeing everything from internal newsletters to the national media attention that had followed our remarkable turnaround. Story. The documentary was something I'd initially resisted. Harvard Business School had approached us about creating a case study of rapid organizational transformation, but the producer had convinced me that sharing our story might help other companies avoid the mistakes that had nearly destroyed Mitchell Industries. If David's failure and my father's contingency planning could serve as a cautionary tale that prevented other families from going through similar trauma, then the temporary discomfort of public scrutiny would be worthwhile. I made my way to the conference room where the production team had set up their equipment. The interviewer, Dr. Patricia Chen from Harvard's Organizational Behavior Department, had spent the past week conducting interviews with employees, board, members, and industry analysts. Her questions had been thoughtful and probing, focused less on the dramatic succession story and more on the practical elements of cultural transformation. I want to start with something that's emerged consistently. In our interviews, Dr. Chen said as the cameras began rolling, multiple people have described your leadership style as quietly revolutionary. What do you think they mean by that? I considered the question carefully. Over the past 2 years, I'd given countless interviews and presentations about organizational change. But this framing was new. I think they're referring to the fact that we've achieved dramatic results without dramatic methods, I said. Revolution implies sudden, disruptive change, but what we've done here is more like careful cultivation. We identified what was already working well and created conditions for it to flourish, while systematically removing obstacles that prevented people from doing their best work. Can you give me a specific example? Take our innovation pipeline. Under previous management, new ideas had to navigate multiple approval layers and justify immediate profitability before they could be explored. We eliminated those barriers and created what we call innovation time, where employees can spend 10% of their work hours pursuing improvements or exploring new possibilities. I pulled out a folder of recent patent applications and prototype designs. In the past 18 months, that program has generated 47 viable process improvements, 12 new product concepts, and 3 breakthrough innovations that are already generating revenue. The Morrison Lunar Habitat project I mentioned earlier actually originated from an idea developed during innovation time. Dr. Chen nodded, making notes. That's interesting because it suggests that the capacity for innovation was always there. Exactly. Our people are incredibly creative and knowledgeable about their work. They were just operating in an environment that discouraged initiative and punished risk-taking. Once we changed the environment, the innovation happened naturally. The interview continued for another hour, covering topics from financial performance to employee development to community impact. Dr. Chen was particularly interested in how we'd managed to balance rapid growth with cultural stability, something many companies struggled with during periods of expansion. We've been very intentional about bringing new people into an established culture rather than letting growth dilute our values, I explained. Every new hire goes through a comprehensive onboarding process where they learn not just their job, responsibilities, but our company's history, values, and expectations for how we treat each other. After the interview, I walked through the facility with Dr. Chen, letting her see firsthand how the principles we'd discussed translated into daily operations. The tour had become one of my favorite parts of hosting visitors because it showcased the real story of our transformation. People who felt valued, engaged, and empowered to contribute their best efforts. We stopped by the research and development lab, where David was working with a team of engineers on prototypes for the European expansion project. His role as Vice President of Strategic Development had evolved considerably over the past 2 years, and he'd become genuinely excited about the technical challenges of adapting our manufacturing processes for different market requirements. "David," I called out, "do you have a minute to explain the modular design concept to Dr. Chen?" My brother looked up from the prototype he'd been examining, his face lighting up with the kind of enthusiasm I'd rarely seen from him during his brief tenure as CEO. The work suited him perfectly, combining his analytical skills with genuine creative problem-solving that didn't require the interpersonal leadership abilities he'd always struggled with. "This is actually pretty exciting," David said, launching into an explanation of how we were adapting our core manufacturing capabilities to produce components that could be assembled into different configurations depending on client needs. The European market values modularity and customization in ways that American clients typically don't, so we've had to completely rethink our approach to product design. Dr. Chen asked several technical questions that David answered with impressive depth and clarity. Watching them interact, I was struck by how much my brother had grown into his current role. The defensive arrogance that had characterized his early leadership attempts had been replaced by genuine expertise and collaborative communication. As we continued the tour, Dr. Chen observed the easy interactions between management and floor workers, the cleanliness and organization of the production areas, and the obvious pride people took in their work. These weren't things that could be mandated from above. They emerged naturally when people felt respected and valued. "One more question for the cameras," Dr. Chen said as we returned to the conference room. "What advice would you give to other family businesses facing succession challenges?" I thought about the complexity of our situation, the pain of watching the company nearly collapse, and the ultimate vindication of my father's faith in long-term thinking over short-term convenience. "Document everything and plan for multiple scenarios," I said. "Family dynamics can cloud business judgment, so create objective measures of performance and stick to them regardless of personal relationships. Most importantly, remember that inheritance isn't the same as qualification. Just because someone is family doesn't mean they're automatically equipped to lead. And for the person who does inherit leadership responsibilities, earn it every day. Don't assume that your position gives you credibility with employees or clients. Credibility comes from competence, consistency, and genuine care for the people affected by your decisions. Focus on serving others' success rather than asserting your authority." That evening, I attended the monthly board meeting where we reviewed our financial performance and strategic planning updates. The transformation in these meetings had been as dramatic as anything else we'd accomplished. Where David's board meetings had been tense affairs focused on damage control and consultant presentations, our current sessions were collaborative discussions about opportunities and challenges. "The Morrison contract is ahead of schedule and under budget," reported James Crawford, our longest-serving board member. "More importantly, their quality assurance team has indicated they want to discuss expanding the partnership to include their Mars exploration initiative." The Mars project represented a potential 8-year, $300 million commitment that would position Mitchell Industries as a primary supplier for humanity's next great adventure. The technical requirements were extraordinary, but our team was confident we could meet them. "What's our capacity situation if we take on additional aerospace work?" asked Patricia Walsh, who had become our board chair after we restructured the governance model to include more diverse perspectives. "We'd need to expand again," I replied, "but we've identified the facility space and have preliminary agreements with the technical school partnerships that would supply the additional skilled workers we'd require." The discussion that followed was exactly the kind of strategic planning my father would have appreciated. Long-term thinking, careful risk assessment, and genuine concern for how growth would affect our existing employees and community relationships. I move that we authorize Sarah to begin formal negotiations with Morrison for the Mars project, Patricia said, with the understanding that any final commitment will require board approval of the expansion plans. The motion passed unanimously, a level of confidence and trust that had taken months to rebuild after the chaos of David's brief leadership tenure. After the meeting, I found myself alone in my office, reviewing correspondence that had accumulated during the day. Among the usual mix of vendor communications and client updates was a handwritten letter from someone I hadn't heard from in months. The return address showed it was from Linda, postmarked from the coastal town where she'd moved after selling the family estate. Since the transition, my stepmother had largely disappeared from our lives, pursuing what she described as a simpler lifestyle that didn't involve the complexities of family business dynamics. Dear Sarah, the letter began in Linda's elegant script. I've been following the company's success through the trade publications, and I wanted you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished. I owe you an apology for not recognizing your capabilities sooner, and for the role I played in supporting decisions that nearly destroyed what your father built. I leaned back in my chair, surprised by the tone of genuine contrition. Linda had never been one for emotional vulnerability or admitting mistakes. I've spent the past year in therapy, working through my own issues around family dynamics and financial security. I realize now that my fear of losing the lifestyle I'd become accustomed to led me to support David's leadership even when it was obviously failing. I was more concerned with maintaining my position than protecting the company's future. The letter continued for several pages, describing Linda's new life and her growing understanding of how her behavior had contributed to the family crisis. She'd started volunteering with a nonprofit that helped women develop financial literacy and business skills, work that she found more fulfilling than the social activities that had previously occupied her time. I know I can't undo the damage I caused or the stress I added to an already difficult situation, but I wanted you to know that I've learned from my mistakes and that I'm genuinely grateful the company ended up in the right hands. Your father would be incredibly proud of the leader you've become. I set the letter aside, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Linda's apology was unexpected but appreciated, and her willingness to examine her own role in the crisis showed a maturity I hadn't previously associated with her character. The next morning brought news that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Forbes magazine had selected Mitchell Industries for their Companies to Watch list, highlighting our rapid transformation and sustainable growth model. The article described our approach as a masterclass in values-driven leadership and predicted that our employee-centric policies would become industry standards within the next decade. More meaningful than the media recognition was the internal response to our success. The employee satisfaction survey we conducted quarterly showed continued improvement across every metric. People weren't just satisfied with their jobs. They were genuinely excited about coming to work and contributing to something they viewed as important and worthwhile. The apprenticeship program had become so successful that we'd started receiving visitors from other companies wanting to understand how to replicate our model. 3 major manufacturers had already implemented similar programs based on our curriculum and training methods. The State Economic Development Office had asked us to serve as a flagship example of modern American manufacturing, hosting delegations from other states and even some international visitors. Sarah, you have a call from the White House, Rebecca announced, poking her head into my office with an expression of barely contained excitement. The call turned out to be an invitation to participate in a national manufacturing council focused on workforce development and economic competitiveness. The Secretary of Commerce wanted to include leaders who had demonstrated innovative approaches to employee development and community investment. We're particularly interested in your apprenticeship model and how it's contributed to both business success and local economic development, the Secretary explained during our conversation. Would you be willing to serve as an advisor on expanding similar programs nationally? I accepted the invitation, recognizing it as an opportunity to influence policy in ways that could benefit manufacturing communities across the country. My father had always believed that successful businesses had obligations to the broader community, and this seemed like a natural extension of that philosophy. That afternoon, I met with David to discuss the European expansion timeline and coordinate our responses to several new business opportunities that had emerged from our growing reputation. Our working relationship had evolved into something neither of us could have predicted during those early months of transition. The German engineering firm wants to establish a formal partnership for precision components, David reported, spreading technical specifications across my desk. They're impressed with our quality standards and think there's significant opportunity for collaborative development. What's their timeline expectation? 18 months for full integration, but they want to start with a pilot project. Within 6 months to test compatibility and workflow. We spent an hour reviewing the technical requirements and financial projections. David's analysis was thorough and his recommendations sound, reflecting the expertise he'd developed in international business development. How's Linda adjusting to her new situation? I asked as we wrapped up the business discussion. David smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression I'd seen from him when discussing our stepmother. She's actually happier than I've seen her in years. The volunteer work gives her a sense of purpose she never had when her primary role was maintaining social status. And the coastal town suits her personality better than the country club scene ever did. It was gratifying to know that even Linda had found positive outcomes from the dramatic changes our family had experienced. Her letter had suggested genuine personal growth, and David's observations confirmed that she was building a more authentic and fulfilling life. As evening approached, I made my final walk through the facility, a ritual that had become as important to me as the morning coffee meetings and afternoon strategic planning sessions. The second shift was settling into their routines, and the nighttime atmosphere of the plant had its own distinct energy. I stopped by the quality control lab where Marcus Chen was training 2 new inspectors on the advanced testing protocols, required for aerospace components. The precision instruments and detailed documentation represented the kind of investment in excellence that differentiated Mitchell Industries from competitors who prioritized cost reduction over performance standards. How are the new team members adapting to the aerospace requirements? I asked Marcus. Better than expected. Both have manufacturing backgrounds, but the precision tolerances and documentation requirements are significantly more demanding than anything they've worked with before. They're asking good questions and taking the training seriously. The conversation reminded me of why our approach to workforce development had been so successful. Rather than treating employees as interchangeable resources, we invested in their capabilities and created advancement opportunities that benefited both individual careers and company performance. On my way out, I passed the employee break room, where several people from different departments were gathered around a table, discussing ideas for improving workflow efficiency. These informal problem-solving sessions had become common throughout the facility, another sign that people felt empowered to contribute beyond their basic job responsibilities. Driving home through the familiar streets of our small manufacturing city, I reflected on how much had changed since that shocking morning. In the lawyer's office, the company that had nearly collapsed under misguided leadership was now thriving in ways that exceeded even my father's ambitious vision. More importantly, we'd proven that business success and human dignity were not competing priorities but complementary elements of sustainable growth. The documentary crew would finish their filming next week, and their case study would eventually reach business schools and corporate boardrooms around the world. If our story helped even a few organizations avoid the mistakes that had nearly destroyed Mitchell Industries, then sharing our experience would have value beyond our own success. But as I pulled into my driveway and prepared to end another day of meaningful work, I was most grateful for the simpler truth that my father's faith in me had been vindicated. The company he'd built was not just surviving, but thriving under the leadership he'd believed I could provide. The employees he'd cared about were prospering in an environment that valued their contributions. The community he'd been committed to supporting was benefiting from our growth and stability. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, just as every day had since I'd first accepted the responsibility of leadership. But tonight, I was simply content to know that the legacy my father had entrusted to me was secure, growing, and serving purposes larger than any individual ambition. The revolution he'd quietly set in motion through that carefully crafted codicil had achieved exactly what he'd intended, ensuring that Mitchell Industries would be led by someone who understood that true success was measured not just in financial returns, but in the positive impact a company could have on the lives of everyone it touched. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out!